to a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And we have to remind ourselves that we are still coming from a specific perspective, mindset, and point of view. And it's super important to constantly remind yourself and each other to step out of the shoes of how you're thinking. You're operating an inherently wider lens now than the technical aspects. All of this is easier said than done.
Welcome to the Midgame Mindset. Join us as we dive into the pivotal moments that shape today's top sales and marketing leaders, RevOps innovators, and entrepreneurs. This is where grit meets growth and the game changes for good. If you find value in this conversation, be sure to share it with another growth leader who would enjoy it. And now, let's get to the show. Welcome to the Midgame Mindset. I'm your host, Rich Bishop, and today's guest is a fellow member of the Outlier Project, Morgan Gebhardt. Thanks for joining, Morgan.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate you being here. Now, for those of you that don't know, Morgan has spent 30 plus years in the tech world. The last 20 or so, he's been a chief revenue officer. He's a multi-time founder. He currently is working as a strategic advisor in multiple startups, as well as a fractional CRO. Morgan, those are just a couple of the highlights. Would you mind giving us a little bit more about you?
Sure. No, happy to. You hit sort of the key professional stuff. I would say, zooming in on tech a little bit, I started out in tech as a 20-year-old co-founder of a fintech company. Fintech wasn't a word then. So, I don't know if we're ahead of the trend there or what. Back in the early days, in fact, kind of technically pre-public internet, so we distributed our product, or access was achieved to our product via CompuServe's dial-up network back in the days of modems. Still aging myself. And then I would say the career arc really was always sort of at the front edge, leading edge, not by design, just I think by how the cards fell in automation, in AI, conversational AI, AI enablement and training. So I've always sort of been at that, not bleeding edge, but the front edge of tech. It's kind of a comfortable place for me at this point. And I enjoy being where the cool stuff is happening. Yeah. And then personally from the New York area, born and raised, a little stint in LA and other places, but, could never leave the New York City area. And 3 kids, happy dad, all that good stuff.
Oh, that's fantastic. I love that. And when we start off on this show, one of the things that we really like to focus on is something that we found in common with a lot of growth leaders over the years is this moment that we call the midgame moment. It's this point in time where you're faced with either a challenge in your company or in your career that you end up drawing on experiences from outside of work, whether that be your personal experiences, from mentors, from books, in order to adjust your mindset, which then gets you past it and onto new heights. As I explain that, are there any mid-game moments that come to mind for you?
Tons of mid-game moments. Some people might call them pivots, personal pivots, right? Yep. I think maybe I'll double click on a couple of them. 5 or 6 meaningful ones. I'd say the first one that comes to mind is not so distant past. I had spent close to 15 years at a startup, joined that business when it was just over 2 million in ARR, employee number 27, and really sort of key to building that business, partnering with the CEO founder and some of the founding team. If you fast forward through 2 pivots of that business, again, from services to automation to conversational AI, to over 300 million in annual recurring revenue. Great journey. But after a while, something was off. It wasn't right. And I had that realization that I had to take stock, step back, and recognize that there were dynamics that were beyond my control, right? Mm-hmm. We have an illusion of control, most human beings, right? We think that we can directly influence all of the events around us. But in the end, that only goes so far. And I had that realization that the business was kind of eroding from within first. And it was increasingly difficult for me to have an impact, drive effective change, continue that growth trajectory. But after 15 years, it's really tough to step away. And the decision I made wasn't to step away into another opportunity. Right? The decision I made was to step completely away from the working world, right? And talk about that mid-game moment. It was a full reset, a reboot, a sabbatical, time to work on myself, time to challenge who I was, draw on and reflect on all of the past experiences I'd had. And, also, look outwards into other sources of wisdom. It was actually the time that I joined the Outlier Project, then Talent Champions Council. And, focusing on community and looking for that sense of purpose outside of the working world, which so many of us have at the center of our sort of selves.
Mm-hmm. For sure, that sense of community is important, and it's hard when you're in that grind of, especially the startup world, where it's so fast paced. Startup world, so venture capital, private equity backed companies, there's always an urgency to delivering results and to making change happen. That must have, 15 years is a long time to be grinding and going, and to go from 2 million to 300 is a massive change. You had to have, I'm sure, rewrite the organization multiple times in order to get there. How do you go from that grind and the gas pedal being down all the time to sabbatical? That had to have been a challenge.
Yeah, it was. It was, on one hand, very difficult. There was the constant sort of combination of pull to keep me in that action, and frankly also that a little bit of a sense of guilt, counterbalancing that pull, that gravity, that I wasn't taking effective care of myself, and if I couldn't take care of myself, I couldn't care for those around me. Right. The transition itself was, after I made the decision and after I exited, I won't say that I didn't have recurring dreams of being back in the workplace on the regular for weeks, if not months, right? It's sort of, that becomes really part of your life. But I was able to recenter on other things. I was fortunate to have a piece of property that shortly after I took the sabbatical, moved the family to our house in the country, full-time out of the city. And that gave me literal and figurative grounding in a way. I started working in the forest doing timber stand improvement. I helped my wife start a flower farm. I just centered on being in nature more than anything else. And that made that transition so much easier.
Yeah, for sure. And how long did that sabbatical last?
So, I took that sabbatical open-ended intentionally. I had some sort of rough imaginary timelines in my head, like, hey, maybe I'll take it for 3 months or 6 months. We'll see how it goes. 3 months after I exited the business, this little thing called COVID happened. And I, of course, blessing in disguise in a way, where, the decision we'd made to leave the city. And so I looked at that and I said, hey, right, maybe this is just another sign from the universe, if that's how you want to look at it, saying, no, you really need a break to disconnect. Whether you like it or not, you're going to be isolating out here. And so I would say that sabbatical lasted just short of 3 years. And I was lucky enough to have had enough success in the previous business to have the safety net,
sure,
to allow that to be open-ended. And, through that, doing a little bit of consulting or advisory work as it came up, completely on my own terms. And I would highly advise anybody that can take an extended break. I don't know if I would advise 3 years, but for me, it was right.
Yeah, the world was working in your favor in that sense, just in all of the change and upheaval that took place in 2020 and beyond from there, for sure. What would you say is probably the biggest aha moment or learning that you took into account or figured out while you were on that sabbatical?
Yeah, I love that question. So many things. If I kind of try to find the intersection of self and career and purpose, I would say it helped me. I reconnected with something I think I'd always had. I think I got it from my mother, which is an innate sense of empathy and compassion.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized one of the things that was burning me out in the workplace, at least that specific workplace, was that the grind also came with a lack of appreciation for others, who they were, how they showed up, the challenges that they may be going through inside and outside the workplace. And it helped me sort of get back to and recenter on leadership style. And that's kind of really where I found myself doing a lot of reflection and focus was, how can I bring that to the fore in a very intentional and conscious way and lead with empathy and compassion. And while still, of course, being able to be in the role where you're making decisions, and sometimes those decisions are difficult and they impact people and not everybody's going to be happy.
Sure.
And I think the other thing that was really at the center of that journey was that it's not about you, or in my case, me, right? That as much as we center ourselves in our own narrative, we are not the center of anyone else's narrative. And it really helps you move through space with others, and again, in a very intentional way.
That actually, the whole concept of it not being about you, I think any parent out there will know real quickly that that is the number one learning that you pick up the moment that you bring that child home is, guess what? Your life is not about you anymore. And that can take a number of different shapes and sizes. But when you look at it that way and apply it to work and apply it to building businesses and growing businesses, it really can make a difference in the culture and the business that you're building, right?
Yes. Well, absolutely. And interesting you mentioned culture. I also spent a lot of time thinking about culture because I was coming from a pretty toxic workplace culture, and that intentionality that I wanted to come out with extended to the kind of culture, not that I just wanted to be in, but that I could foster. And I certainly brought that to my next role, which is a CRO role at a business that was in the AI space, AI enablement, data labeling and annotation for building AI models, both visual and language. And the company I joined itself had a very intentional culture in place, which was so important for me. And the thing a lot of people miss about culture is they think you set culture from the top with mission and vision and values. You can write as many values on the board as you want. Culture springs from the collective people in that business or community, not from the top down. In fact, you create more friction when you try to force culture on folks. But you have to live the culture you want to create and foster yourself, right? Yep. Maybe people call that lead by example. For me, it's a little bit more lead with intentionality. There's that word again. And allow the dynamic to find its footing. And then lean into the good aspects, the positive aspects, right? And have, by the way, difficult conversations. It's also part of it, right? A healthy culture is a culture where people can be vulnerable and still feel safe. And that's the other aspect that was really important to me, building a culture of safety, because people perform their best when they feel safe.
For sure. And going back to some of the early research that Google did and coining the term psychological safety, which has really become a buzzword out there. In fact, I think it's grown to the point where now it's misused a little bit, where employees who maybe don't take ownership in their own or responsibility for their own actions and their own deliverables end up saying, well, my boss didn't make me feel psychologically safe, and they turn it into this weapon almost. But when you go back to the root of it, it's really about setting that environment where your people can stretch themselves and they're encouraged to stretch themselves. And if they mess up, that's okay. As a leader, you've got them and you're going to encourage them. But they also need to own their part of it, which is taking responsibility, right? Being, having the foresight to know how what they do impacts the people around them. It's a give and a take, not just one way.
Absolutely. That sense of responsibility extends then into accountability, where, and it's, frankly, it's difficult for a lot of people. I mean, for most people, even though you can sit and live in, a sense of responsibility and accountability and still, acknowledge that it's difficult. I mean, when we make mistakes, when we make mistakes that impact others, it's not a comfortable place to be, right? But it's important to accept that the mistake happened and that I'm accountable, if I own that mistake, for the outcomes. And in a leadership role, you're accountable for your decisions. You're accountable for your team. And it's important if you show them how to be accountable through holding yourself accountable, and not just up the chain, but down the proverbial chain, and meeting your commitments and acknowledging when you fail or you're falling behind. It goes a long way in creating that sense of safety, because accountability doesn't come with punishment, right? It becomes with acknowledgement and understanding and learning, so that you can move forward, and thrive and succeed.
And there's a shared sense of responsibility around that as well, when that culture is set properly, that if I fail, I feel bad, not because I missed the mark or I didn't do what I was supposed to do, but because I let my teammates down.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And I've always had that sense. And again, it's one of those things that as I reflect on conversations like this, and in the lead up to the conversations like this, it's an opportunity to go way back and realize, hey, where did I get that feeling of walking with accountability? And it goes all the way back, I think, to when I was a musician before I went into the technology world. And when you're a musician, especially when you're playing in a large group, like an orchestra or singing in a chorus, you're inherently accountable to every single other musician around you, because you're all working for that common purpose and goal. And that purpose and goal, especially when it's a performance, is now, it's real, it's immediate, right? And so you have to live and sit with that accountability in real time in that moment. And it becomes somehow innate, I think. And it's the same thing, playing competitive sports, you get that same sense of accountability because you succeed or fail as a team. And everybody has a role to play, even if, by the way, you spend 50 minutes out of 60 minutes on the bench. Those 10 minutes are still super important, and you're still making a contribution that can be key, if not pivotal, to the success or failure of your team.
Yes. And that reminds me of, first of all, I think the musician in an orchestra or in a chorus makes so much sense, because if somebody's off pitch, the entire thing is going to sound terrible, the entire performance, right? And my daughters dance competitively at a national level, and they put hours and hours and hours into the practice, just like a musician does, so that when they're on stage and they're performing, it's as crisp and clean and together as possible, because of that accountability and because that practice has been there over and over again. And you brought up something earlier too, when you were talking about kind of feeling when the right time to leave was, that there was something a little bit off. There was almost your intuition kind of kicked in. And I'm wondering, does the intuition to know whether things are going right or something needs to change, does that come from those hours and hours of practice like Malcolm Gladwell talks about, or is that something else?
I think maybe for some people it's A, other people it's B, meaning for some it's those hours of repetition. For others, it is the synthesis of the collective experience. It's the IQ versus EQ, right? And it's the muscle memory versus sort of the internalized sense. Actually, to draw another reference point from the Outlier Project, years ago, there was a gentleman, guest speaker, who'd written a book, Flight of the Wild Duck. I might still have it on my shelf here. And whose name is escaping me. And he had said something that really resonated, right? About intuition. And what he said is, intuition is simply knowing that you know something without knowing how you know it yet.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. It's so simple and profound. And in a more scientific vein, it's pattern matching, right? It's subconscious pattern matching, that over time, ex post facto, right? With time to reflect, you can kind of put the pieces together and go, yeah, that makes sense. I know why now I felt the way I did. I was seeing these things. I just wasn't consciously putting them all together to create the full puzzle in front of me. And we can't always solve that puzzle. Sometimes we have to trust that sense that we get from our inherent pattern matching abilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. And, that then reminds me and brings me to you love to work with startups. That's really been your world. So you go through your sabbatical, you come out on the other side. I'd love to hear what it's like to get back to that. But I also want to tie that into some of the best strategic advisors and some of the best serial entrepreneurs are the ones that have had enough at bats or naturally have that instinct and intuition around what's going to work and what needs to happen at certain stages along the way. I'd love to hear what your journey was like back into the startup world, and then how that intuition and pattern recognition goes into helping to make a startup successful at the different stages.
Yeah. It's a big question. I'll try to stay on track as I answer it. So what was it like getting back up in the startup world? I would say I was ready at that point. I'd been increasingly engaged again in community and not just personal or developmental community or networking communities, but professional as well. And I was increasingly getting that itch to get back into the action, to sink my teeth into a business, and either build that foundation for the next phase of growth, or do that really deep triage diagnosis and figure out what needs to change in order to move it forward. So once I sort of stepped foot back into the business world, and by the way, the startup I joined was a post Series C startup. PE backed by that point, right around that sort of 50 million revenue mark.
Mm-hmm.
So, quote unquote, mature startup, flirting with the true growth phase, right? That real scale up part of the journey, and facing all of the challenges that come with it. I would say it took a while for me to also step back once I stepped back into it and reflect and say, hey, where am I at? How's this going? Because like muscle memory, it all just clicked into place right away and just hit the ground running. You have no choice. I mean, if you've operated in the startup world, as I know you have, you started a dead sprint, and then you can hope to be able to accelerate from there. And certainly that's what it was like for me. I have to tell you, and again, plenty of challenges I had to face when getting back into the business. But what was really grounding and kept me focused and working hard, but not grinding proverbially, was that sort of refreshed focus I had on team and people and culture and being a very present leader, which is, there's something of an ailment or a malady that some folks have as they rise through the ranks and elevate their sort of themselves into leadership roles. They forget or get disconnected from what it was like being in those roles that are a level or 3 or 4 down in the organization. Mm-hmm. And I love nothing more than, for example, as a revenue leader, digging into a call analysis with an AE, right, and helping them tune their pitch, right. And of course, I don't step on my VP of sales toes doing that, but you're always operating with limited resource as you're trying to build a business. So all hands on deck, right? Mm-hmm. So it was a rapid transition. It was one that I was ready for sure. Now the second half of your question, and forgive me, it was around
the intuition and pattern recognition. Yeah. And when you're a strategic advisor, a big part of what you're doing is to help the startups see around the corner and get to the next step. Yeah. How does that come into play for successful advisors?
Yeah. I wish I had a well-articulated answer there. I think part of it is because of that, because of the accrued years of experience. Um, you know what you know, even if you forget that you know it, which is, I guess, another way. It's a reverse intuition. I'm not sure.
Sure.
Which is to say, as you step in to a new business, whether it's as in a full-time leadership role, a fractional role, an outside advisor role, um, you're not thinking inherently about every aspect of where they are specifically in each part of the business on their journey. But when you step into that part of the journey and you see what's happening, whatever dynamic is unfolding, there are those aha, yeah moments. And they I don't know about you, but they come up more often than not. Say, I've seen this before. Okay, got it. And even when it's a different challenge, it's not so different as to be foreign. You've seen things that are similar. You can draw on those accrued experiences, while I would say also making sure you're holding a little humility, because the world is always changing. And just because we see a scenario that looks very similar or the same to one we've come across before, the underlying conditions may be different. So I always also try to bring an inherent sense of curiosity to the table to really dig in and unpack what's actually going on. So I wish, like I said, I wish I had a scientific answer to say, well, here's the secret sauce behind successful advisors. In that case, or in this case, I think I'm going to lean heavily on, repetitions, man. It's as you mentioned, as a musician, a dancer, an athlete, it's repetitions, and being observant, paying attention over the span or arc of your life and career. Like, not just sort of going through it and then leaving those moments in the past, but creating time and space to understand and unpack those experiences. It's so much easier to draw on them when you've reflected.
Yeah, having a growth mindset and having that be a central part of the way that you approach life in general certainly helps with that. I like to compare that scenario of the startups or working with different companies to a puzzle, right? But each company that you work with, the puzzle pieces are shaped differently, and you start with a different set of, or different parts of the picture that are on the board. So you know what the end picture looks like, but how those pieces come together, in what order those pieces go, and frankly, the method by which you get the pieces on the board are all going to be different. And that's where a lot of the creativity can come into play as you're working with these different companies.
Absolutely, yeah. And I like the analogy of puzzle pieces, and I'm sure you've seen it as well. The earlier the stage, the fewer the pieces, but the bigger the pieces are relative to the impact
Yes.
of which piece you put where, what comes first. The sort of ordinality of prioritization is so critical right from the outset. Focusing on the right things at the right time and leaning into them, knowing that there are other priorities, but if it's not the top priority, then it has to take second seat. Easier said than done. And this is where I think you also see, some founders and early stage folks struggle as businesses get to certain stages, because the mindset, the skill set, the experience that's required to make those foundational, critical, big playing pieces decisions is very different than one where you have now, 1,000-piece puzzle and very complex interplay. And it's not a simple equation. And this, by the way, is not me saying, hey, early stage folks, they're lucky to have it easy. It's simplicity. Actually, it's a much harder job because the impact of those early decisions in many ways are existential decisions and can be sometimes immediately existential.
Yeah, there are limited resources, obviously, and no matter what stage you're in, there are limited resources. But when it's founder or founder and co-founder, and you start off there, there is a trade-off in terms of what you're spending your time on, and it's really easy to get wrapped around the axle on doing a bunch of little things that really don't make an impact, as opposed to stepping back and going, no, what are we really trying to do here? And let's think about what's going to get us the furthest, and let's work on that piece first, right? It's the importance, making sure you're working on the most important thing, not necessarily the most urgent or what seems the most urgent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, and this is something I try to be very conscious of and bring to the table with founders and co-founders, myself included, by the way. It's the concept of Maslow's hammer, and Maslow's kind of actually falsely credited with coming up with it. I can't remember the actual genesis. And in the very oversimplified stating of it, it's like to hammer everything looks like a nail, right? And we have to remind ourselves that we, even with collective accrued experience, and even this very diverse experience, are still coming from a specific perspective, mindset, and point of view. And it's super important, especially if you're working with co-founders, very early stage, making big, pivotal decisions, to constantly remind yourself and each other to step out of the shoes of how you're thinking. Like, I inherently bring a very go-to-market centric mindset to the table. It's where I've spent vast majority of my time. But I have to remember, for example, hey, but if this is a product business, what does go-to-market mean if we can't ship? Right? Or if there are faults and flaws and bugs, or if we're misaligned with the value equation, right? And we're solving a problem that looks really compelling with the product, but the value realization on the other end is not there. It's misaligned. That is, it's not a go-to-market. It becomes a go-to-market problem, but you don't solve it with go-to-market. And I do the same thing. If you have a technical founder who's running a business, especially if they don't have depth and operating experience, there's a lot of coaching and reminding and pulling out of the comfort zone of, that's great, but, right? It's you're operating an inherently wider lens now than the technical aspects. And, easier, all of this is easier said than done. But certainly stepping out of our shoes and into others and understanding how those decisions, impact direction and velocity, super important.
Yeah. Now, this year, 2025 that we're talking about now, there have been a lot of headwinds, tailwinds. Some of them have been running into each other with the political environment and tariffs and all of these things going on. I know that at the end of last year, a lot of people in the VC and PE world were a little hesitant to make investments. Obviously, interest rates are high right now, and they continue to stay high. But it seems like over the last few months now, Q3 timeframe, end of Q2 of 25, that there's the capital is starting to flow a little bit. I'd love to hear your take on kind of what the environment is right now around VC and PE, especially as we look toward the end of 25, beginning of 26.
Yeah, I think I would agree with your general assessment. It felt like wallet purse strings were tight, sort of the back end of last year, maybe even tighter at the front end. Definitely a loosening. I mean, look, capital that's sitting on the sidelines is always going to want to be allocated, right? If we sort of imbue personality or sort of character into capital, but nobody likes undeployed capital unless you're weathering a really bad macroeconomic storm and you're trying to keep some dry powder. But I'm definitely seeing. I mean, look, AI is driving so much investment across the board. I'm hesitant to liken it to other sort of frenzies and bubbles. I lived through the .com bubble, .com 1.0, and the frothiness that came with it. And there are plenty of opinions as to whether or not we're in an AI bubble. But the reality is the demand is driving the investment. And as long as that demand is there, I think innovators are going to innovate, which means businesses are going to be formed, and they're going to be looking for investment. And there is plenty of capital out there to be allocated. So I'm definitely seeing more action. And also, frankly, just from the professional side of inbound interest in mainly from PE-backed firms looking for a little more mature stage leadership in that CRO role, which is also a signal, right? That that the investment world is active, if not boiling over yet. We'll see. I have my opinions about how much capital is being allocated into data centers and that physical infrastructure, and that's anchored to actually one of the businesses I'm advising right now. Again, saying, hey, there might be a better way to scale than linearly scaling physical hardware.
That's interesting.
It's not sustainable.
Yeah, true. Yeah, and it's a challenge that I think a number of different companies, even the big boys, are really struggling with and trying to figure out how it is that they solve that.
Yeah. And that business itself, they're kind of at a pause in their seed raise. They're going to finish their seed raise in a couple of months. I can't remember the last count. Now, these are all not like, top of the list, super hot, super interested, but they've obviously spoken over the months or years to well over 100, probably close to 150 VC firms, mostly early stage, some more mature ones, and just gauging by the interest. And I'm not speaking specifically to what they're putting together, the company, although I think it's compelling. Otherwise, I wouldn't be there. But just to see that interest and the engagement coming from the VC community, to me, is signal that the action is there. And I'm hoping, maybe it's false hope, that this round, as we see, not the seed round, but the bigger round of the cycle of boom and bust, of startup tech and venture investment, I'm hoping that there's some greater wisdom around allocation of capital and the bets that are placed.
Sure.
And that's a whole separate conversation, by the way, about how sort of the fundamental underpinning of the mechanics of VCs and how they make money.
Sure. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. In 2020, there was a big frenzy of investments that were made. It was really kind of growth at all costs at that point in time.
Was the SaaS boom. Yeah, SaaS was just the hottest thing.
And people were dumping money into it like crazy without any real regard for profitability, right? And sustainability of that growth. Then you hit 22-ish, where there's a backlash going the other way and investment really slows down. There's a high emphasis on sustainable, profitable growth as being the main driver. So we're really back to EBITDA focus, even at a VC level, right? But things had been restricted so much that investment really didn't take place, but those that did invest were focused on that. So we're almost in this in between where we really haven't had the movement of capital out there with that primary focus of EBITDA. And it seems like now we're at the top of the hill. And how much does that snap back to not or less emphasis on EBITDA and more emphasis on multiples of revenue instead, right? Where do we end up falling in that back and forth?
One always hopes, as you mentioned before, like if you're a parent, right, you live this, that lessons are learned, right?
Yeah.
Touch the hot stove, you get burned. Okay. Touch it a second time, you got burned again. You forgot. The third time, you're going to remember. Collective memory, I think, works a little bit differently. I certainly see what you're also observing. Perfect example, and I think, frankly, they're an outlier, but they're being sort of held up right now as a great shining example of that trend is Cursor, which is fastest to $1 billion ever SaaS business. AI based. AI-based code generation, right? Um, and one of the reasons they're a darling, not just because of the rate, the velocity with which they grew, but the fact that they're doing that with a lean. And when I say lean team, I mean tiny. I can't remember what their revenue per head count was, but it was something crazy like 10 million or more.
Wow.
Just nuts out there. I say that's an extreme example because look, there's always something lurking around every corner, right? And for them, it was a decision. I think I'll give them a little bit of benefit of the doubt, Grace. I don't know the folks over there, but perhaps not grounded in lots of operating experience. Younger team, I think first-time founder or founders, and including operating experience. And I think for the right reasons, they did the wrong thing. And you see this a lot, pricing changes, right? And they updated pricing and their subscription model and plans. And they built that business. The reason they got so large so fast was it was effectively product-led growth, community-driven, individual developers loving what it's doing for them, making their jobs easier. And they built a very loyal base very quickly. But what happens with a very loyal base when you move their cheese, right? They revolt. And so they've gone through that bump. There's a bump in the road. And maybe it's hope. Hope's not a strategy, but my hope is that the proverbial smart money, the folks who've been around, who've been through a couple of those boom and bust phases from the investment side, are bringing those lessons learned and helping founders and businesses, portcos, regardless of stage, find that balance, right? Find the balance of, hey, there is a certain amount of fuel to pour on this fire, right? But if we pour too much fuel too fast, the fire's going to burn really, really bright, right? But then those flames are going to die down, right? And you ran out of fuel, right? So how do we create a sustainable growth, right? How do we find the balance between aggressive growth investment and focus on bottom line, structural, sustained growth? By the way, there's nothing better than finding that sweet spot by recognizing that you're in a business that has enough free cash flow that you can pick and choose whether or not you're taking a profit or you're going to reinvest in growth. That gives you the ability to pause ever so slightly and reflect and go that level deeper to say, but is this a good strategic investment? Will it pay dividends, right? Am I listening to the right and looking at the right signals here? Rather than being just pushed to pour rocket fuel and we'll figure it out once we get there. Rarely works.
Yeah, for sure. Morgan, I really appreciate the conversation. This was a lot of fun. I'd love to find out from you one of the questions that really I think gets to the heart of somebody's experience is, as you look at your children now growing, and let's say they're at the point or getting ready that they're off to college or starting their own careers. Based on your experiences, what's the one lesson or value that you've earned over the years that you want to make sure you impart to them?
Yeah. I'll go back to something I said earlier. It's not about you, right? Move through the world, move through life, recognizing that you share space with everyone else around you. And if you center yourself at your story and your narrative all day, every day, you're missing the opportunity to truly grow. You're missing so many wonderful, enriching, rewarding experiences. You're constraining your ability to learn from others, and you're moving with blinders. And I have to tell you, Rich, and on a personal level, real positive change at the social level, right, across the world, can't come from folks who are centered in their own narrative. You have to move with empathy and compassion and think about other people, be a very different place. But, as parents, right, it starts with our kids. And if we can instill that sort of that philosophy in them, well, then maybe they'll carry it with them and maybe they'll share it with not just their kids, but others around them.
I love that. Thank you, Morgan. And if people want to follow you and learn more about what you're up to, how do they do that?
Best thing to do is find me on LinkedIn. Morgan, middle initial A, Gebhart. Not that there are a lot of Morgan Gebhardts out there, right? So I'm pretty easy to find. Just feel free to send me a connection request, DM me. I'm always open to meeting with and connecting with new folks.
Great. And we'll include that link in the show notes as well for those of you that,
Awesome.
that want the direct path. So Morgan, thank you again for the conversation. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us on the Midgame Mindset. If today's episode sparked a new idea or helped shift your perspective, share it with someone who's ready to grow. Subscribe, leave a review, and keep playing the game. With the right mindset, the best moves are still ahead. Until next time, keep changing the game.